Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute fiercest conflicts happening in modern technology right now, the escalating battle over tech's walled gardens and the fight for digital control. We are going to unpack exactly how developers view these app restrictions and, more importantly, what it all means for the devices sitting in our pockets right now. Let's get into it. But before we get completely bogged down in all the complex legal jargon, we really have to step back and ask what is actually at stake for the tech we use every single day. I mean, are these strict app ecosystem rules genuinely protecting us consumers from some wild west of malware? Or, as a lot of software developers argue, are they just taxing innovation and holding back the next generation of tech breakthroughs? To give you an idea of just how divided people are on this, look at a recent poll from the Audio Science Review forum. They asked users if forcing Apple to allow third-party apps outside their official store is a positive step. 25 people voted yes, it's positive. But a pretty solid chunk, 11 users, voted negative. And another 9 said it doesn't even matter to them because they use Android. So it really just goes to show the clear consumer polarization here. This is definitely not a one-sided debate. All right, part 1, inside the walled garden. To really understand why developers are pushing back so hard, we first need to define the battlefield. A walled garden isn't just some catchy metaphor, right? It is a deeply entrenched, highly lucrative business model. It's designed from the ground up to offer a completely seamless end-to-end experience. Apple's probably the most prominent example we have of this highly controlled integration. They build the physical hardware, they program the software running it, and they act as the absolute sole gatekeeper for the stores that sell you the apps. And guys, the scale of these ecosystems is literally massive. Just to put it in perspective, at the end of last year, Apple held a staggering 64% of the US smartphone market. So the crucial takeaway here is that when we talk about a walled garden, we are not talking about some tiny niche community. We're talking about the primary digital reality for the vast majority of American smartphone users. Moving on to part 2, why developers push back. With such a massive user base locked securely behind those walls, software developers are getting incredibly vocal about their frustrations. A really great way to get inside the developer mindset here is to look at a concept called FRAND commitments. FRAND stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Basically, standard-setting organizations use these commitments to make sure that when a company owns a crucial piece of patented tech, like, say, the standard for cellular communication, they can't just exploit their dominant market position to unfairly tax everyone else who has to rely on that standard. For developers trying to build on these massive platforms today, this core principle of fair access is exactly what they feel is completely missing. Which brings us to what they call the innovation tax. You know, we've actually seen this exact tension play out before in massive lawsuits, like Apple versus Qualcomm. In that specific case, Apple was basically acting as the developer, relying on Qualcomm's chips. And Apple accused Qualcomm of unfairly raising their royalty rates simply because Apple invented new features, like Touch ID. Apple argued that Qualcomm was taxing innovations they had absolutely nothing to do with. Fast forward to today, and well, many third-party app developers feel Apple is doing the exact same thing to them, using their gatekeeper status to take a massive cut of the revenue generated by the independent developer's own hardware. But of course, the platform owners say, hey, it's not about taxes, it's about safety. And that brings us to part 3, the security debate. So, just how secure are these walls? Well, software developer D2013 over on the Audio Science Review forum argues they actually create a total false sense of security. They point out that, frankly, hackers always find a way in. And what's really fascinating is they cite research suggesting that when the top 1% of advanced hackers do breach a walled garden, the very security features meant to keep the bad guys out actually shield those hackers from being detected. It acts like an impenetrable fortress for the intruders. On top of that, they argue this closed system makes users uneducated and complacent, leaving them way more vulnerable to things like phishing attacks. On the flip side, supporters of the closed model fiercely disagree with that take. Forum user Ron Texas counters that centralized verification is the exact thing keeping the average consumer safe. His view is that filtering everything through an official app store objectively increases security by blocking out the rampant malware you see in unverified third-party stores. From this perspective, a developer's demand for open access, well, it's just a desire to bypass store fees, sacrificing everyday consumer safety in the name of corporate greed. So it all boils down to a pretty stark trade-off.
A closed ecosystem prioritizes verified safety and a beautifully curated user experience, but it totally restricts access. An open environment, on the other hand, champions developer freedom, consumer choice, and the ability to sideload apps, but potentially at the cost of a much higher exposure to malware. Which leads us to part 4. Regulators enter the chat. With platforms and developers at a complete stalemate over these trade-offs, global watchdogs have decided they can't just sit on the sidelines anymore. And they are coming in heavy. Leveraging their new Digital Markets Act, the European Commission recently slapped Apple with a massive €500 million fine over its App Store practices, specifically trying to force them to allow third-party app stores and modify those strict commission structures. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Department of Justice has stepped into the ring too. The DOJ filed these huge, comprehensive antitrust suits against Apple, claiming that their walled garden business model actually worsens security instead of improving it, and that it illegally restricts interoperability with competing devices like Android phones or non-Apple smartwatches. For all those frustrated software developers, this kind of heavy-hitting legal action is exactly the lifeline they've been begging for to finally level the playing field. However, we have to remember the regulatory landscape is constantly shifting. As outlined by Capital Advisors Group, recent geopolitical and administrative shifts indicate that the antitrust momentum against big tech might actually be slowing down in the U.S. A more AI-focused and protective U.S. tech policy under the Trump administration, combined with moderated leadership at the FTC and DOJ, suggests a pivot. Instead of seeking major breakups, regulators might start favoring cooperation. We're even seeing global ripple effects, like China dropping its antitrust probe into Android. So, for independent developers, this means the regulatory calorie they were hoping for might be tapping the brakes.
All right, part 5, innovation versus control. With regulators swinging back and forth between aggressive fines and cooperative policy, we really have to ask how this whole tug of war impacts the actual pace of technological advancement. To figure this out, we can look to 2 classic economic theories. The Schumpeter view argues that massive companies with near monopoly power actually drive innovation, simply because they alone have the massive capital required to invent at scale. But in stark contrast, the Arrow view argues the exact opposite, that concentrated market power absolutely frustrates invention. Kenneth Arrow's theory suggests that without the very real threat of open competition, tech giants just lose their incentive to improve, choosing instead to safely collect rent on their existing products. Developers, as you might guess, clearly align with the Arrow view, arguing that walled gardens stifle the exact competition necessary to drive real progress. But honestly, here is the most fascinating twist in human behavior. Even when regulators do force changes, consumers might not even care. When the European Digital Markets Act forced platforms to display choice screens, basically making users actively choose their web browser or search engine instead of just accepting the default one, the market shares for incumbents like Google Chrome barely budged. It turns out, consumer habits are incredibly hard to break. This suggests that even if developers manage to tear down the walls, users might just consciously choose to stay inside the garden anyway.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. As developers relentlessly push for the freedom to innovate without paying an ecosystem tax, and platforms double down on the security and curated experiences that consumers clearly love, we have to ask, does dismantling the walled garden truly give developers the freedom to unlock a brand new era of technological innovation, or does it simply compromise the everyday safety we've all come to rely on? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the tech use every day, and I'll see you next time.